Lassie Farm here. This will be episode 6 of The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate by Ted Chiang. This episode from the barn. Let me tell you the story of another person who used the gate, and you can decide for yourself if he was prudent or not. Bassarat proceeded to tell me the story, and if it pleases your majesty, I will recount it here. The tale of the weaver who stole from himself. There was a young weaver named Ajib who made a modest living as a weaver of rugs, but yearned to taste the luxuries enjoyed by the wealthy. After hearing the story of Hassan, Ajib immediately stepped through the gate of years to seek out his older self, who he was sure would be as rich and generous as the older Hassan. Upon arriving in the Cairo of 20 years later, he proceeded to the wealthy quarter of the city and asked people for the residence of Ajib ibn Tahir. He was prepared, if he met someone who knew the man and remarked on the similarity of their features, to identify himself as Ajib's son, newly arrived from Damascus, but he never had the chance to offer this story because no one he asked recognized the name. Eventually, he decided to return to his old neighborhood and see if anyone there knew where he had moved to. When he got to his old street, he stopped a boy and asked him if he knew where to find a man named Ajib. The boy directed him to Ajib's old house. "That is where he used to live," Ajib said. "Where does he live now?" "If he has moved since yesterday, I do not know where," said the boy. Ajib was incredulous. Could his older self still live in the same house 20 years later? That would mean he had never become wealthy, and his older self would have no advice to give him. At least none Ajib would profit from following. How could his fate differ so much from that of the fortunate rope maker? In hopes that the boy was mistaken, Ajib waited outside the house and watched. Eventually he saw a man leave the house, and with a sinking heart recognized it as his older self. The older Ajib was followed by a woman that he presumed was his wife, but he scarcely noticed her, for all he could see was his own failure to have bettered himself. He stared with dismay at the plain clothes the older couple wore until they walked out of sight. Driven by the curiosity that impels men to look at the heads of the executed, Ajib went to the door of his house. His own key still fit the lock, so he entered. The furnishings had changed, but were simple and worn. Ajib was mortified to see them. After 20 years, could he not afford better pillows? On an impulse, he went to the wooden chest where he normally kept his savings and unlocked it. He lifted the lid and saw the chest was filled with gold dinars. Ajib was astonished. His older self had a chest of gold, and yet he wore such plain clothes and lived in the same house for 20 years. What a stingy, joyless man his older self must be, thought Ajib, to have wealth and not enjoy it. Ajib had long known that one could not take one's possessions to the grave. Could that be something that he would forget as he aged? Ajib decided that such riches should belong to someone who appreciated them, and that was himself. To take his older self's wealth would not be stealing, he reasoned, because it was he himself who would receive it. He heaved the chest onto his shoulder, and with much effort was able to bring it back through the gate of years to the Cairo he knew. He deposited some of the money with a banker, but always carried a purse heavy with gold. He dressed in a Damascus robe and cordovan slippers and a fancy turban bearing a jewel. He rented a house in the wealthy quarter, furnished it with the finest rugs and couches, and hired a cook to prepare him sumptuous meals. He then sought out the brother of a woman he had long desired from afar, a woman named Tahira. Her brother was an apothecary, and Tahira assisted him in his shop. Ajib would occasionally purchase a remedy just so that he might speak to her. Once he had seen her veil slip, and her eyes were as dark and beautiful as a gazelle's. Tahira's brother would not have consented to her marrying a weaver, but now Ajib could present himself as a favorable match. Tahira's brother approved, and Tahira herself readily consented, for she had desired him too. Ajib spared no expense for their wedding. He hired one of the pleasure barges that floated in the canal south of the city and held a feast with musicians and dancers, at which he presented her with a magnificent necklace. The celebration was the subject of gossip throughout the quarter. Ajib reveled in the joy that money brought him and Tahira, and for a week the two of them lived the most delightful of lives. Then one day Ajib came home to find the door to his house broken open and the interior smashed and ransacked of all the valuable items. The terrified cook emerged from hiding and told him that robbers had taken Tahira. Ajib prayed to Allah until, exhausted with worry, he fell asleep. The next morning he was awoken by a knocking at his door. And we will leave the story there and continue in the next episode. Thanks for watching.